So there's a lot of controversy around Afghanistan right now, especially concerning the withdrawal and its execution, but there's also some questions around the decision to withdraw itself. At the beginning of the withdrawal, the Taliban were as strong or even stronger than they were when the war started. The original goal of attacking bin Laden and his close Al-Qaeda operatives had already been achieved for at least a decade, and the nation-building dream seems now like a fantasy to most people. Still, there is some plausibility to the arguments presented by those who want to stay, even though there isn't overwhelming evidence in support of their views, and often evidence that contradicts it. At this point, at best we can only speculate because a lot of it depends on what the Taliban is going to do. Most of these fears center around the idea that now that the Taliban has taken control of Afghanistan, the country will become a convenient place for terrorists to hide, where their networks and training grounds will be kept away from the eyes of the world under the cover of the Taliban regime. This is, after all, what the primary goal of invading in 2001 had been: to root out bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and their terrorist training camps which had been hidden in the country. Of course, the Taliban then as now has a lot of reason to oppose these terrorists. Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were heavily detested by many Taliban fighters because of the negative attention they were bringing to Afghanistan during their early reign. The Taliban wanted to focus on creating a stable regime which they could then rule with Islamic law, but Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, who were trying to provoke the United States into a war in Afghanistan, were threatening that. This is why the Taliban has often been found to be fighting Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terrorist groups because they threaten the stability of their regime. After spending 2 decades trying to get back into power, it doesn't seem likely that the Taliban would be eager to risk their fledgling regime again. In any case, this is all speculation, and it is possible that once the Taliban establishes itself more firmly, it could let in terrorists back again or expand its goals more internationally. If you're interested in learning more about the myths surrounding the relationship between Taliban and Al-Qaeda, there's a great book called An Enemy We Created: The Myth of the Taliban-Al-Qaeda Merger. It's plausible that the Taliban may once again harbor international terrorists, but it's not an inevitable possibility. What I really want to address is that a lot of people have this middling position between withdrawing and staying, and that is that we're not going to completely withdraw, we're still going to stay in charge of all the airports and bases, etc. But we're also not going to have a re-escalation. We're just going to have enough troops, maybe 2,000-3,000, and that's going to be enough to support the Afghan National Army and keep the Taliban at bay so that we can achieve our long-term goal of stopping Afghanistan being used as a terrorist staging base without actually having a full-fledged combat zone. That we could achieve our goals in Afghanistan without having a massive financial or human cost. And while we can't predict what could have happened, this position seems contrary to all of the prevailing evidence, and I don't see how the Taliban could have been held back without another re-escalation of efforts. So let me explain why. Early on in the withdrawal process, certain people in favor of withdrawal, such as the president himself, pointed to and believed that the 300,000 strong Afghan National Army would be enough to hold back the Taliban, at least for a significant period of time. Obviously, that happened to be false, as the Taliban easily swept through them. It's been rightly pointed out that the ANA was crippled by the American withdrawal since it relied on US air support, financial support, and logistical support. All it would have taken would be a small US support pillar of a couple thousand troops to mount an effective resistance against the Taliban. I have 2 primary reasons for not believing that this is the case. First, and I think as many people already know, the actual strength of the Afghan National Army has been heavily exaggerated. It's been known for years that the idea of a cohesive, several 100,000 strong Afghan National Army has been mostly a myth. The number 300,000 plus in itself is probably inflated. Any number is necessarily a speculation, but accounting for ghost soldiers and those combat personnel who could actually be a fighting force against the Taliban, the number is likely closer to 200,000. But then we'd also have to account for the extremely high desertion rates, low morale, and corruption. When all these matters are accounted for, the actual fighting force against the Taliban, which could put up an effective resistance, is much smaller than we would assume. This is backed up by the US Department of Defense, which showed in 2018 that around 20,000 of Afghan Special Commando forces do around 80% of the actual fighting. It is these guys, the best of the Afghan National Army, who would benefit the most from US support and who have been doing most of the fighting against the Taliban. But even before the withdrawal, for the last several years, while they still had US support, these forces have been struggling against the Taliban and have been stretched quite thin. Which leads me to my second point. I've heard this quite a bit recently, the idea that 2,000 or 3,000 US troops would be able to support the ANA enough to hold back the Taliban. The wording though is misleading because holding back implies that it would prevent the Taliban from actually being able to mount an effective resistance which could take over the country. In other words, it would keep the Taliban down. The reality though is that this additional support could only hold the Taliban back from a complete sweeping victory as had just happened. The Taliban haven't been losing this war, they haven't been held down. In fact, they've been on the verge of winning back province after province for several years now. The last year or so has been a lull because of the peace deal, which was made on the condition of withdrawal, and while the Taliban has made some offensives, these were preparatory to a larger simultaneous offensive intended to take back the whole country. The Taliban has been gaining ground for years. In 2015, the government government controlled about 72% of the country's districts. By 2018, that number had fallen to 54%, with the Taliban controlling 12% and the rest being contested. Over roughly the same time period, the Taliban's numbers grew from 20,000 to 60,000. Even with force numbers larger than those proposed now, the Taliban were still gaining ground. The very actions of the generals on the ground proved that a small force wouldn't be enough to keep the Taliban back. All plans proposed in the last few years by the likes of James Mattis, H.R. McMaster, and others have all asked for thousands of more additional troops. And even with these additional troops, it's never been suggested that this would be enough to hold the Taliban down or do much more than shore up the defenses to prevent a full breakthrough. In other words, a limited force, even in numbers larger than the ones that have been proposed recently, would likely do little to effectively stop the Taliban. To sum up the argument briefly, the problems that we've seen would and did exist even with US support. This is why even before the withdrawal started, there were generally two directions you could take in analysis. Either one was for the withdrawal, or the second was to re-escalate efforts. To take just one example, you may have heard that the Afghan National Army heavily relied on US support for their aircraft, not just in terms of air support, but in terms of maintaining the actual assembly. I've heard the argument that even with limited US support, the ability to prop up the ANA's air power would vastly increase its effective fighting resistance, but with the US withdrawing, the ANA's air power was critically diminished. But like I said earlier, these problems existed well before the US started to withdraw. By 2017, Afghan forces were having a very difficult time against their adversaries. One obvious limitation that they were having was the amount of air power they had, and so it was proposed that hundreds of millions of more dollars be spent to provide the ANA with new aircraft, to the point of almost doubling it, plus all the additional effort and time it would take to train the new pilots. But the ANA was barely maintaining its existing aircraft even with substantial US support, to the point where some suggested this expansion wasn't even feasible, thus making an even greater contribution required. Problems like these, which the Afghan National Army was littered with, which supposedly a limited US troops could bolster, existed well before plans for withdrawal were even made. The war in Afghanistan has been riddled with euphemisms like hold the Taliban back, break the stalemate, provide support, and other such phrases, which always make it seem like victory is just over the horizon with a little bit more time and a little bit more money and a few more soldiers. And this isn't something recent either. It was around a decade ago that the surge in Afghanistan had taken place when an additional 30,000 US troops were sent there. This was headed by General Petraeus under Barack Obama, and by that point there was probably 100,000 or more coalition troops in Afghanistan. There was still great hope for victory. After all, how could the Taliban resist such an overwhelming force? Even then though, some people were able to predict that this wasn't going to go down well. The late Michael Hastings predicted accurately how General Petraeus' strategy would end up failing in an article in February 2011. I specifically bring up Hastings and his piece because of one part of the analysis that I thought was particularly illustrative of the whole war and the recent problems that I just mentioned. This was Hastings' analysis of the strategic report that was released in 2011 concerning the war with Afghanistan, which Petraeus helped write. Keep in mind that this was at a time when the number of troops in Afghanistan was far greater than the amount that is recommended by those who want to continue staying today. Quoting Hastings, "The strategic review did little to clarify the timetable for withdrawal. The final report, in fact, says almost nothing. We are making progress, but that progress is fragile and reversible. We have broken the momentum of the Taliban, but there will still be heavy fighting next year. The troops will start coming home soon, but they won't start coming home soon. We aren't nation building," the president says, "that will stay in Afghanistan past 2014 to build its nation." It was, in the end, a non-review review. Plans for re-escalation in 2017 had much of the same tone. US officials under H.R. McMaster reportedly told the Washington Post, "The current US-Afghan war strategy is built around a 4-year plan to push back the Taliban that is not likely to yield significant results until its later stages." This is when troop numbers were expected to be around 10,000, several times greater than they were around the time of withdrawal, and the supposed goal of pushing back the Taliban here was to have a position of leverage in seeking peace negotiations. In other words, even the generals themselves, who most consistently call for staying in the country, didn't actually believe that a small force would be able to hold the Taliban back over the long term. Which means, as far as I can see, there were only two options: either withdraw completely, or stay in, re-escalate, and prepare for a fight.